When I was a little girl, I grew up in rural Nebraska, and in the summertime, I would often go to my grandmother's house. Now, she wasn't the warm and fuzzy kind of grandma you're thinking of. She always had tasks for us to do. Gather the eggs, clean out the chicken house, pick the green beans, and if you picked the green beans, you would have to stem the green beans. And I can distinctly remember one time she and I were sitting on the porch. And we were stemming green beans and stemming green beans, and I was trying to explain to her how my chore at my own home was to gather the eggs. And we have these sitting hens that were big and fat, and they would sit in the nest all day long. And they would sit on those eggs. And as a little girl, you were expected to reach under there, get the eggs, and put them in the basket. But that sitting hen would constantly peck you. And I said, "Grandma, I just hate that job." My grandma said, "Now listen, little Pullet." That's what she called me, little Pullet. She said, "Little Pullet, this is what you do. The next time your mom has pork and beans, you save the can. And you wash the can out and you take it out to the chicken house. And when you're ready to gather those eggs under that sitting hen, you put the can over that chicken's head and reach under there, and she'll peck inside the can, but she won't peck you." And I'll tell you, that worked like a charm, it did. And after a couple times, I even remembered to take the can off the chicken's head. But then she proceeded, my grandmother, to tell me a story of when she was a child. Now, my grandmother's family immigrated here from Holland. And they went to Nebraska, and for many years they lived in a dugout. And when my grandma was a young girl, her mother developed appendicitis. And there was no treatment at the time, and she perished. So my grandmother was raised by her father, which would be my great-grandfather, and her brothers. And her job was always to do the chicken chores as well. Now, she would throw mash out to the chickens, and they would all come running. And in those times, she said, we just let the sitting hen sit on those eggs until they would hatch. And one spring, a whole mess of little chicks hatched. They come scuttling out the barn with their moms, and one of those little chicks was not all yellow. It was speckled. It had black, and it had a little white, and it had a little yellow. My grandma said it was a throwback from the Leghorn line. I didn't really understand any of that at the time, but it was her favorite little chick. And she made sure that that little chick got extra mash and extra oats, and she watched over that little chick. And that little chick grew and grew and grew feathers out, but they weren't white feathers like the Leghorns, but it was speckled feathers, brown and black and a few white. And my grandmother loved that chicken. And she said she named that chicken Little Pullet also. Well, it must be in chickens as it is in people, because when that chicken was a little different than the other chickens, they picked on it. And Grandma felt so bad that they would pick on that chicken. Why, as she fed them, she would always have to feed Little Pullet separately because they would crowd Little Pullet out. And when they went out to scratch in the pasture, they would chase after Little Pullet. So Little Pullet would go further and further into the pasture and scratch here and scratch there and let the rest of the flock do what they did. And Little Pullet would come in late at night, and she would get on the roost. And sometimes Grandma said they would knock her off the roost. Well, Little Pullet grew, and that summer it got very hot. And then the storm clouds started just boiling and boiling up. And all the chickens ran back into the chicken house. But Little Pullet was far out into the pasture, just a scratching and a pecking and a scratching and a pecking, and didn't seem to notice the storm coming. It was a tornado. It knocked down trees, and it took off part of the hog shed, Grandma said, and Little Pullet just hunkered down as close to the ground as she could. And when that high wind passed, little Pullet hardly had any feathers left except on her belly. Well, now she looked really odd. And summer turned to fall, and the feathers started to grow back in. And fall turned to winter, and little Pullet was mighty cold that winter. Now, Grandma would always have hot water she would take out to the chickens in the morning, and she would break the ice in their water, and then she would pour the hot water in, and it would last most of the day so the chickens would have plenty to drink. And she always made sure little Pullet got a good drink. But one morning it had been bitter, bitter cold the night before, and all the chickens hopped down and little Pullet stayed on the roost. And Grandma went over there, and she could see that now little Pullet's claws were frozen solid to the roost. Well, she called her big brother Garrett, and she said, "Garrett, little Pullet can't get off the roost. Can you help her?" Now, you can imagine what old Garrett looked like. He was a big, brawny farm boy with great big hands like a bear. And he come in, "Oh, what is the matter with that dumb chicken?" And he grabbed hold of little Pullet's leg and jerked it. And it snapped right at the joint where the yellow meets the white feathers. Well, in her case, the speckled feathers. And ripped her leg right off. Oh, Grandma said she cried and she cried and she carried little Pullet around. And they told Grandpa. Grandpa says, "Well, put her on the porch. It is too cold to be butchered chickens. We'll butcher when it warms up." So Grandma said she took one of Garrett's overalls and she wadded it up and made a little nest for little Pullet on the porch. And she gave her some mash and made sure she had a little water that night. And Grandma worried about little Pullet all night long. And in the morning, lo and behold, the big old yeller cat was on the porch. Oh, Grandma thought, this is a bad thing. But the old yeller cat was in them overalls with little Pullet, and they were keeping each other warm. They became the best of friends. Grandpa, he was watching that, Great-Grandpa, and thinking it was kind of humorous, and so he didn't butcher little Pullet right off. And in time, little Pullet was able to peck, 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 and hop a little bit on her one leg, and her other leg healed up some, but she was pretty immobile. Christmas came. Grandma said, "We got an orange, and we got some hard sucking candy, and she got some new mittens." And then Garrett came over with a brown package. It was wrapped in a string. And he smiled at her and he said, "Here, Hannah, I made you something." And she opened it up ever so carefully. And in it was a wooden stick about yay long and a leather harness above it. And then there were straps. She says, "I don't know what this is." And he says, "It's a peg leg for little Pullet." Great-Grandpa laughed, and they brought little Pullet in the house. And they put that prosthetic leg on that chicken. And lo and behold, that chicken stood on her good leg, and she'd tap that prosthetic leg almost like she was tap dancing. And before you know it, she was walking around the kitchen floor. Step clunk, step clunk, step clunk. Everybody had a joyous Christmas just because little Pullet could finally walk. Little Pullet spent the rest of the winter on the porch with the yeller cat and her peg leg. But when spring came, little Pullet would hop off the porch, and Grandma would always put her back on the porch at night. And that yeller cat would always stay pretty close, watching out for little Pullet, watching out for little Pullet. But one spring morning, the mother chickens were so jealous of little Pullet getting all this attention, they done flew over the fence into the yard. And they attacked little Pullet. And there was a lot of cackling and squawking and carrying on, and the cat finally broke it all up, but Grandma come running out, and there lay little Pullet. And you could tell that she was just despondent from this. and her peg leg had fallen off. So Grandma carefully reattached little Pullet's peg leg, but she could see that she just didn't have the spunk anymore. She wasn't scratching and pecking. It wasn't soon after that, but little Pullet disappeared. Grandma looked everywhere. She looked under the porch, and she would look in the bushes, and she looked in the wash house. She looked around the wash house. She couldn't find little Pullet anywhere. The yeller cat just hung its head and kept patrolling the yard. It was about 3 weeks later, Grandma said she saw little Pullet. Little Pullet came out of the barn. She'd been underneath the granary part of the barn. And behind her was trailing 6 little chicks. They were all speckled, they were. And every one of them had a peg leg. That's the story of little Pullet.